Hello and welcome back to Imagination Mansion. So today, along a similar vein to my previous video, I have a book suggestion list today. I thought I'd do one for just general autumn-winter cozy vibes. Also, I got this jumper recently and it is so big and cozy and warm and I love it. This video is technically split up into categories, but much less categories. No wait, many fewer categories than last time, because there's only two, which is fiction and non-fiction. Because for me, autumn, I don't know if it's because it's like the academic half of the year, but autumn winter for me is always a time to read like cozy non-fiction books. These are my recommendations of what I like to read at this time of year. So first up, I have a classic, which is Harry Potter, specifically the Philosopher's Stone. I love to read it this time of year. It's just a cozy wizarding adventure and it just gives me those soft vibes. And yeah, it literally has a chapter named Halloween, but it's not that spooky, which is why I didn't put it in. I mean, I suppose it could be seen as spooky because, you know, you have the whole Voldemort head thing, but this is such a cozy book for me and I read it like every autumn. So I've got that one. And then another classic is Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days. So this is just a cozy adventure of a guy who's literally like, right, I am going to travel around the world in 80 days. And it's a great story, it's a great adventure. It's also a great telling of mistaken identity. There we go. It's also a great story of mistaken identity, and half the story is literally that Mr. Fix chasing Phileas Fogg around the world because he thinks he's got his man, and it's just Phileas Fogg being completely oblivious to this, even though the rest of the characters are like, this dude's been tailing us for a while, we should do something. But I also just love the character of Phileas Fogg and just how detached he is and how eccentric. Like, Jules Verne tends to write about quite eccentric people, probably because he was probably quite eccentric himself. So yeah, there's that one. And then next up is Warhorse by Michael Morpurgo. And this is a sad story, but it's once again like an older story, and it is a powerful story of the truest of friendships in the worst of wars. And I don't know, it feels like a book to read in the darker half of the year, because it is a bit of a darker book, it is a bit of a sad book, and it feels like the kind of book to read when it is a bit more of the colder, rainier season, because that's the feeling I get from the book. So there's that one. Also, I watched the stage play of that in the Lowry in Manchester, and there's a bit where there's a gunshot, and because the Lowry is quite small, it echoes. So next up is another classic, which is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now this is unironically one of my favourite books. I hadn't touched it, and then we had to do it for sixth form, for literature sixth form, and I fell in love with it. Like, I think Jay Gatsby is a great character, and Nick Carraway is a great unreliable narrator in terms of like, he is very biased towards who he likes and who he doesn't like. And I think that makes for a great story, and it just kind of shows the kind of people that live in the 20s and that kind of like divide between new money and old money. And yeah, it's another set in an era books which I think are just great to read at this time of year. Next up is a bit of an odd one, which is The Last Days of New Paris by China Miéville, which is this one. There we go. So this is basically a surrealist painting come to life, or at least put in literature, and it's set in the 40s and 50s, and someone has managed to capture and channel the imaginative power of the surrealists, and the streets are stalked by living images and texts and by the forces of hell, and it's just so bizarre, and it's misty, and it's a mystery as well, and there is references to art movements and the war and all that kind of stuff, and yeah, so that's that one. So a different type of classic this time is the Spiderwick Chronicles, which I just think, like, they were one of the first fantasy books that I read, like, series for kids, and that's by Tony E. Terlizzi. I've realised I've never said that out loud before, and Holly Black. And it's basically a story of a trio of siblings who find this book about fairies and about the problems that unearthing this book causes by basically bugging the fairies and the hijinks that come from doing that. And it is just such a cozy book, especially this one, because it's set in this house that's like falling down, and it's adventures, and they've just moved house, and it's a new start and all this kind of stuff. I love the entire series, and they're quite small, so they're quite quick to read. And there's 5 books in the series, and I think they're just cozy, autumny fantasy fairy goodness, and I love them. Next up is another kind of odd one, is Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot. So this is a play where the point of the play is that nothing happens, and I think just the stagnancy of it is one of the reasons why I like to read it this time of year. That's the thing, I don't know if I'd be able to sit down and watch this, like, as an actual play, but I do love reading it. The humour comes from the stagnancy, and I just think it's a classic, and it's great, and I love it. Next up is a new favourite, which is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, and this is just such a cozy adventure book, and you've got, you know, Bilbo, who's obsessed with food, and just dwarves that are dragging him on this adventure with Gandalf, and there's a dragon, and it's just classic children's fantasy that has spanned generations and is now also a great adult fantasy, just because it didn't stop being good once you grew up. So I had the unique experience of only reading this as an adult. I didn't read this as a child, even though it was originally classed as children's literature. It is just... And I think one of the reasons why I also found it quite cozy is because obviously I haven't watched the Hobbit films, but I have watched the Lord of the Rings films, and so I kind of almost had the soundtrack for that playing in my head while I was reading this, and so I know that the Hobbit films are a lot different to the book, because there is no way they could keep it the same and have 3 films for a book this size. Honestly, I'm looking forward to watching them just for, one, the nostalgia of Lord of the Rings, because I know that they kind of slipped some characters in there for the fans, and 2, honestly, just for the atmosphere, the music, the vibes, the aesthetic, because to me that is like peak autumn, and I love it so much. So next up is Marcus Zusak, The Book Thief. There's quite a lot of war books in this, I'm realising, and I think it's just because the books are quite dark but hopeful, and this is a great book, and it's also, I think, because this one is about books as well. So it's slightly spooky because it's got death as a narrator, but it is honestly a lot about life as well. It is just a very good book, and I highly recommend. And next up is one of my favourite books, which I read a bit too young, actually, which is Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. Now, this is such a good, like, mystery novel. I don't know if that's what it's intended as, but it's just, I think for me, just the art history mixed with the mystery, mixed with cults and hidden knowledge and all that kind of stuff, because I also like love the film. Once again, the film is a bit different to the book, as they always are, but just as a standalone thing, it is also great, and it has a great soundtrack as well. I think if a film has a great soundtrack that brings out the vibe of the original book, it's one, in my opinion. But so there's this one, and yeah, it's one of my favourites. And then lastly, for the fiction portion of this video, is one of my favourite books that I read every autumn, because it's mostly set in autumn, is Haruki Murakami's Norwegian Wood. This was apparently Murakami's first proper novel, and apparently like a lot of his like OG fans were quite disappointed because they're like, oh, it's just a love story, and I'm like, it's also just, having read, like, this was, to be fair, the first Murakami book I read, but it's still odd. Like, people saying, oh, it's just a normal story, it is still very unusual. It's an unusual take on the love story, I think. So it's set in Tokyo University, and every time something happens, it seems to happen in autumn. Whenever he hears her favourite Beatles song, Toru Watanabe recalls his first love, Naoko, the girlfriend of his best friend Kizuki. Immediately, he is transported back almost 20 years to his student days in Tokyo, adrift in a world of uneasy friendships, casual sex, passion, loss and desire, to a time when an impetuous young woman called Midori marched into his life and he had to choose between the future and the past. And as a time of year that is often seen as a time of transition, like from light to dark, from holiday to school and all that kind of stuff, I think this is a perfect, like, coming of age story, but that's unusual and that's kind of feels slightly supernatural. Even though all the events in here could technically happen, it still has that oddness that I think marks Murakami's books. It's just not quite as prominent as an anthropomorphic frog showing up in your living room. But I like the subtlety of it. Like, I love how subtly weird it is, and it shows like the nuances of mental illness and of things like casual relationships. And I would say if you're uncomfortable around topics like sex and stuff like that, there is quite a bit of that in here. Not necessarily sex scenes, like he doesn't write full-on sex scenes, but it mentions it a lot. So if you're, well, I suppose there is a bit of that in there as well. So if you're uncomfortable with that, maybe not, but I love this book, as you can tell from how long I've babbled about it. So on to the second half of this list, which is my non-fiction recommendations, and these are either gonna be fitting or they're gonna expose me for the nerd that I am. Probably the latter. That was one that I technically missed from the fiction because it almost falls between both sections, which is William Wordsworth's Preludes. Because it's poetry, but it's memoir poetry, which is an interesting genre, I suppose, which kind of falls between the two because it's non-fiction in terms of it's his life, but it's fiction, I suppose it's not fiction, it's poetry. So after that prelude, for the prelude, sorry. So, first up, we have quite a few old books here actually, because first up is Bullfinch's Mythology, and the three topics that he covers in this are the Age of Fable, the Age of Chivalry, and the Legends of Charlemagne. I'll just show you and you can pronounce it how it's actually supposed to be pronounced. And I always find mythology a very cozy thing to read around this time of year, and especially as this covers Greek myths, though they're like Romanized versions of the Greek myths, so I know that makes some people uncomfortable, and it took me a second to get my head around it, especially as it switches between the names sometimes. But this is a very old book. It doesn't say helpful, but the guy was alive in the 1800s, so absolutely older than the 50s, though it might have been reprinted in the 50s, I'm not sure. But yeah, mythology, a great, just cozy read for this time of year. And just, I think this is also like almost like the quote-unquote dark academia time of the year. Like we've had cottagecore summer, dark academia autumn is here. Next up is a book that I actually ended up getting from a sort of like book deposit at university, where basically previous students just kind of like left out the textbooks they didn't want anymore for new students to just kind of like pick up. And so I picked up quite a few that had nothing to do with my course, because I am just fascinated by everything. I mean, it kind of has something to do with it, because it's The Dialogic Imagination by M.M. Bakhtin, translated by Michael Holquist. So that's that one. And so it's basically the sociology around the novel and what constitutes a novel, the place of the novel in society, how the novel has changed, how the definition of novel has changed, and I just found it very, very fascinating. And yeah, there's something about like the sociology of a novel, or the psychology of a novel, however you want to describe it, is just a very, very cozy topic. It's a very difficult topic sometimes, especially as I think it's translated from Russian. Yes, so this has been translated from Russian, so sometimes the word choices are a bit funky, but I quite enjoyed it. And next up is another one I took from the book fair at university that had barely anything to do with my course, which is Dickens and the Invisible World by Harry Stone. And so this is a very, very fascinating book about how Dickens got a lot of his story writing techniques, not necessarily the specific storylines, but he got a lot of his inspiration from fairy tales, and specifically fairy tales read to him by his nurse, I believe. By fairy tales I mean not just simply fairy stories, but folklore, myths, legends, enchantments, dreams, signs, recurrences, correspondences. Indeed, all the mysterious murmurings of the invisible world entered Dickens' imagination and shaped his art. And it is just a fascinating read, and I think Dickens is such a beloved author, and I think he's quite an autumnal author as well. I think the only reason I haven't really read any of his books is just because their size intimidates me, like a lot of the old classics. Like, Oliver Twist is huge, but it is one of my favourite musicals, so there is that. And next up is George Orwell, Seeing Things as They Are, Selected Journalism and Other Writings. There we go. And it's always interesting to read the non-fiction things that fiction writers have said. And especially with someone like George Orwell, who was very aware of politics, and he was very aware of the relationship between literature and politics. You know, with people spreading ideologies. I mean, that's literally what 1984 is. It's him going like, you know, trying to... It's a cautionary tale almost of like, because that and Animal Farm as well. It's kind of like, look what kind of things like you could be promoting, like if you took this too far. And some of them, and it's also very, very interesting because it's almost snapshots from the time as well, because these are all sort of like during and just after the war. Yeah, so we've literally got one here called London Letter, 1st of January 1942. Whom are we fighting against? Our allies, defeatism and German propaganda, the literary front, the food situation. And so it literally gives you glimpses of that time period and what he thought about everything that was going on. Like, literally, I've just seen one here that says BBC, 21st of May 1941, broadcast, literature and totalitarianism, which is literally what I was talking about before. And yeah, he was a very political savvy writer, and so it's very interesting to read what he wrote about these things. Next up is Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. And this, I think, I've read this quite a few times now, and it was such an influential text at the time. It grew out of a lecture that Virginia Woolf had been invited to give at Girton College, Cambridge in 1928. She was just like exploring things that and asking questions that no one had really asked before, or were only just starting to ask. And I think it is like a great book. Even nowadays, it still holds true, because I am not gonna lie, I struggled to do anything creative while I lived in a tiny flat where I didn't have any space to myself. Whereas now, I have a room of my own and I'm actually able to start having this little pocket of silence and space where I can film videos or write at my desk or paint in my little corner, and I'm able to be creative without anyone else wanting my attention or being in the way and having to hide things. And so it still is influential today, I think, and it still has a place. Next up is one of the most nerdy books on this list, if you know, the book about the philosophy of the novel wasn't, which is the Cambridge Companion to Medieval English Theatre. So this was literally one of my textbooks at university. But it is just so fascinating, and I think also, like, for me, I don't know why, but just the medieval ways of doing things were just, reading about medieval stuff just makes me feel autumnal. I think because they didn't have all the technology that we do, so they literally had to embrace, you know, things were getting darker, so, you know, they did most of their plays in the summer. A lot of the time they didn't have set stages and things like that, so they had to tour them on the streets, and it just brings up images of, like, you know, like cobbled paths, and it's that, instead of dark academia, it's just like medieval academia, and just, yeah. And the theatre interests me, as isn't surprising. I did a degree in drama, but yeah, I don't have much more to say in just, I found it fascinating, I find it cozy, and I think it blends the two well together. So next up is Myths and Legends of the British Isles by Richard Barber. So this is another mythology book. As I said, mythology just makes me feel very cozy. And look at that cover. That is just filled with autumnal colours. I didn't start getting into, like, British folklore until I was much older. Like, I think after university was kind of when I actually started to go, like, oh, you know, I've been so fascinated, as most people are, with, you know, Greek, Roman, Norse, Egyptian, that I haven't actually looked, like, I hadn't even really branched into, like, Arthurian myth. You know, I didn't watch Merlin growing up. The only reference to it I have is the film Merlin with Sam Neill in it, and I'm not even sure which version of the mythos that's based on or anything like that, but like, that's how little I know. But I've recently started branching out and actually engaging with the history of my own, like, place. Mythology and history once you go past a certain point in history, almost blend into the same thing. For such a long time, the entirety of the Arthurian myth was taken as like historical canon. The version, like several different versions of Arthur were blended into one, because there was the probably historical figure Arthur, who was probably a chieftain that, you know, chased away a local Anglo-Saxon invader. And then there's obviously the mythical sword in the stone, and then there's the magical Merlin and his sorcery, and then there's dragons, and then there's the medieval with the Knights of the Round Table and the chivalry and all of that. And they all kind of blended into one mishmash. And I find it so fascinating trying to unpick all of that. And yeah, I'm a massive nerd. And then lastly on this list is Joseph Campbell, The Hero with 1,000 Joseph Campbell, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. So this is a book on the psychology of the hero's journey, and that takes place in mythology, and the mythology pattern of creation and destruction. And it's also, so it's basically the art of telling stories, and it's how there are certain patterns within all sorts of different places, like how it says the hero's journey from mythology, and how, you know, there is an art to the way that we progress a story. And I think that quite a lot of people would say that this is like a must read for anyone who wants to be a creative person telling stories. And yeah, I am looking forward to reading this one. I haven't actually read it yet, but it is on my reading list, and I am absolutely going to be reading this. As someone who is a writer and does want to be a published author one day, this is absolutely going to be necessary reading. So that finishes my list of cozy books that I like to read in the seasons of autumn, winter, when it's getting darker outside, it's colder, it's misty, it's raining, and you can just sit with a candle and a book and a big old mug of coffee or tea and some ginger biscuits and just get cozy and lose yourself in a story or learn something interesting and get those academia vibes that I love at this time of year. So if you liked that video, give it a thumbs up, give it a like. I hope to be making more videos like this, more bookish videos. Let me know what you'd like to see from me as well. If you've got any tips and tricks, I always welcome ideas. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!